Okay, good evening. I'd like to call the Economic Development Committee meeting to order of September 28th, 2022. I'll start by calling roll. Let's see, Devon Reed, Councilmember Reed. Okay, I'm here, and Councilmember Newsma.
Here.
Councilmember Burns. Councilmember Burns. He's
I'm here. Can you not hear me?
Now we do.
Okay,
Great.
I'm here. Thanks.
Councilmember Nguyen. Thank you. Councilmember Harris.
Present.
Economic Development Committee member Lisa Deacon.
Here.
Great. Eli Klein. Member Eli Klein? No? And Angela Panisi? Okay, great. All right, we don't have a quorum present, so we won't approve the minutes, but we aren't taking action on any items this evening, so we'll go ahead and proceed. Terrific. So we'll go ahead and start. Most of the evening will be dedicated to hearing the report from Evanston Thrives, and I'll just start, though, first get out of the way our report on our legacy business program. So that's going very well. I'm very excited. We've nominated 30 pilot participants, 30 legacy businesses to be pilot participants. We're hoping that many of these small businesses, legacy businesses, will join us at our working group meeting. We have one meeting tomorrow, and every other Thursday we meet, so to help inform us as we go forward and decide on how to allocate funds and how much to allocate and what would be most helpful to these businesses. So currently we have an RFP out. We're developing a logo and a website and branding for our Evanston Legacy program. So we're very excited to see what we get back from our Evanston artistic community. We hope to have an event looking, sharing and reviewing and voting on what we get back from our Evanston community with regard to logos and branding. So very excited about all that. We invite anybody to come and tomorrow. It's tomorrow at 4 o'clock. Here in room 2404. We meet every other Thursday, and everybody's welcome to attend and participate. So I think that's about it for that. So we'll go ahead and continue on with, I'd like to introduce Sarah Kellerman, Director of Interface Studios, who's going to give us a report on the work you've done around our business districts.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for having me.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Yes, go ahead.
I forgot public comment. Do we have anybody for public comment?
Nobody.
Okay. Okay, we can get back on track.
Take space, make space, right? I would also like to make sure, hey, Michael, could you say something into the microphone? Let's just make sure this is working one more time.
Testing. You hear me?
Yes. All right, thanks. So Michael, the disembodied voice, will help me with this presentation today. Thanks so much for having us. We are here in part to make sure that we all have a shared collective understanding of some of the kind of fundamentals of Evanston's retail ecosystem. From this point, and a lot of the behind the scenes stuff that's happening right now is ideation on a lot of the public feedback we've received. We've had wonderful interactions with Evanston's business community. And so the next time we have a touch point with you all, it'll be a lot more exciting, kind of tangible stuff. But we thought this was really, really important because making sure that we all have a shared foundation is going to be critical to keeping the recommendations of this retail action plan grounded in Evanston's reality. So that's why we're here today. So I am Sarah Kellerman. I'm the director of the Chicago studio of Interface Studio. I'm joined on the call with Scott Page, who is the principal and founder of Interface Studio based out of Philly. So most of my colleagues are in Philly, but I'm local. We're a planning and urban design firm and lead consultant in this work. And Michael, who's on the call, is with MJB Consulting, and he is really a retail expert. And so we're going to go through a handful of slides today. I do just want to say, this is meant to be a conversation. If there's any questions along the way, please just let's stop and talk about it. I think understanding is really the goal. So we'll go at whatever pace makes sense. So let's go ahead and get started. Do I have the thing? I have the thing. So the agenda for today, we're going to go through retail terminology, talk a little bit about retail cycles, how retail is cyclical, what drives retail locations, what can the city control and what can we influence, and then we'll talk about what's next up in the project. Just foundational understanding again, this is sort of a working boundaries of the 8 districts we're focused on at the top here, all the way down to Howard Street, number 8. We are acknowledging that the southwest corner, where a lot of the big box retail is definitely important part of Evanston's retail ecosystem, but we aren't looking at that area with the same sort of in-depth urban design opportunity lens. Since we last met in this room to kind of kick off the project, we've also defined some project goals, and that's what's on the screen. These came from working with our internal committee. That's the downtown organizations and other SSA managers, as well as a task force of business owners and other stakeholders who are helping us kind of shepherd ideas through this project. But ultimately, we wanted to make sure that in establishing this project, we wanted to make sure that we all had sort of the shared articulation of goals in mind as we move forward. Today, I'd like to start with retail terminology. Let's start with the basics. Retail is anything that is open to walk-in consumers. And so that includes really anything that's coming to mind right now. Cafes, restaurants, some personal services, entertainment venues, all of that is part of retail. But there are some more specific definitions that can be valuable to the discussion.
So talking about personal services, does that include massage and stuff that you have to make an appointment for to get a haircut or get a massage or a chiropractor? Stuff like that is considered retail for the purposes of this discussion.
For the purposes of this discussion. And Michael, where would like a doctor's visit fall into this?
Yeah, I mean, you can hear me, right?
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, there's obviously a lot of shading to this. I tend to draw the line if it's a doctor's office that's just appointment-based versus, say, an urgent care center, which welcomes walk-in customers. A lot of it, of course, is in the details, the design of the doctor's office, for instance, if it's at street level. So obviously there's a lot of nuance to this. But for the purposes today, anything that you can imagine accepting walk-in consumers. And should I just continue on with this slide,
Yeah,
Sarah?
go for it.
Yeah, so at the risk of getting into the weeds, the first distinction I want to draw, and it's an important one, are the different kinds of goods and services we have out there. Because the kinds of goods and services that are on offer in a given business district often play a large role in how far that district can draw, right? Let me say a little bit more about that to make it clearer. One type of goods or service is convenience goods and services. And the whole idea with convenience goods and services is that they're effectively commodities. That means pretty much they're the same in price, in style, and quality, roughly anywhere you go. Think of a carton of orange juice, right? Now, the idea is because they're the same anywhere you go, you're just going to go to the store that offers orange juice that's closest and most convenient to you. You're not going to go across town to a grocery store when you can just get orange juice at the grocery store around the corner, right? And so for this reason, districts that are largely about conveniences tend to draw from a relatively local neighborhood base, right? They don't draw from very far afield. And your typical examples of convenience retailers, a Jewel Osco, a CVS, retailers like that. Comparison goods is different, right? Comparison goods, these are goods where the price, the style, and or the quality, they will vary from one store to the next. Think apparel or footwear or jewelry or furniture. And we as consumers tend to gravitate to districts where there's a lot of selection, right? Where there's many different stores selling shoes, many different stores selling clothing. Indeed, we will drive or transit farther for a district that has a larger selection of those sorts of stores. Indeed, that's the whole idea behind the regional mall, right? That we will drive past a local clothing store to get to a larger district or center where there's more options, because we want to be able to compare, right? Examples in Evanston, Matt's Bike Shop, Bookends and Beginnings, Madison Grace, all comparison goods. Then finally, there's a third category, and this is relatively new. It used to be convenience versus comparison. But what's happened over the last 20 years is that conveniences, certain types of conveniences at least, have differentiated, have become more specialized, such that you will drive cross town for a grocery store like a Trader Joe's, even if there's a Jewel Osco closer to your home, right? You will drive all the way to Skokie for an H Mart, right? Even if there's a more garden variety supermarket around the corner, right? These are conveniences, groceries, right? But there's a specialty positioning which kind of makes you as consumers act like they're comparison goods. And this will have implications later on. Okay, next slide.
So moving right along, because there's going to be retail terminology throughout, we want to talk a little bit about retail cycles and trends. So I think the way to go ahead, Michael.
Go ahead. No, I mean, I think, what I wanted to talk about briefly is the elephant in the room, right? E-commerce, because that's, you scratch the surface of these conversations, that's always very close to it. And before I get into it, one interesting aspect of all this is that the rise of e-commerce, it's not all that new, right? If you read about the assumptions consumers could shop at their homes, their choices will be right at their doorstep, and they'll love it. And that's what Amazon is all about, right? Next slide. Well, we kind of had the same thing more than 100 years ago with Sears Roebuck, right? Sears Roebuck was the Amazon of its day. Obviously, barely still with us at this point, but this is not necessarily new. Next slide. And I think the larger point that I want to make here is that you will routinely hear the phrase these days, the new normal, right? We are entering this new normal of X, Y, and Z, right? And at least as it relates to retail, there is no such thing as a new normal, right? Retail, more than any other land use, moves in very unpredictable ways, takes very windy paths to destinations that no one could have predicted. I'll give you an example. Let's take bookselling, right? For those of you in the audience old enough to remember the 1990s movie You've Got Mail, that was Meg Ryan at peak cuteness with her shop around the corner, nice little independent bookshop, that was about to be put out of business by Tom Hanks' Fox Books, right? Fox Books, obviously a proxy at that time for Barnes & Noble. And at that time, the new normal was, okay, these superstores, they're going to wipe out all the independent booksellers, right? And indeed, they wiped out quite a few of them. Well, fast forward to the 2000s, we have the rise of Amazon. And Amazon basically ate the lunch of Barnes & Noble and Borders, such that Borders ceased to exist. Barnes & Noble shrunk in the size of its footprint, closed net 150 stores, right? And at that point, the new normal was, okay, Amazon's taking over, right? Well, what happened then? Well, some funny things happened starting in 2010. Starting in 2010, all the way to the present year, the number of independent booksellers in this country has grown year over year. There are now twice as many of them in 2022 as there were in 2010, right? And during that time, of course, Amazon started opening its own bookstores and then closed them because they weren't very good at it, right? Now, if we had gone back to the 90s or the 2000s and said that was how this was all going to play out, I don't think anyone would have predicted it that way, right? But now we are in kind of a period where there's a sort of renaissance of independent booksellers, not to minimize the challenges that they face, but there's a renaissance of independent booksellers that no new normal had foreseen. And I use that as an example, right, to say that we shouldn't be so fast to jump on what we think we're seeing. My favorite quote is from Mark Twain. It ain't what you don't know that will hurt you. It's what you know for sure that just ain't so. And there's a lot of that going on. So if we zero in on the pandemic and e-commerce, right? You undoubtedly, like me, heard countless times in the early months, 2020, that we were going to see 10 years of e-commerce growth within the span of 3 months, right? And these new shopping habits were going to be ingrained and there was no going back. Well, 2 years since then, what is fascinating is that online's market share has grown from 11.4% of total retail sales back in the first quarter of 2020 to 12.9% in the first quarter of 2022. In other words, about 150 basis points, which ain't that much. In fact, it's not that different from what we would have expected anyway, given historical growth trends without the pandemic, right? So think about that for a second. If ever there was a moment when brick and mortar was going to be relegated to the dustbin of history, it was when we were cooped up in our houses, when there were lockdowns, capacity restrictions, public health concerns, when we weren't going into stores. And 2 years later, it just didn't happen. It didn't. And that should tell us something, right? The last thing I'll say about this, because I've been talking for a while, is that it's not just about the consumer. And you're going to hear that a lot today. It's not just about what we, the consumer, how we want to shop. It's also about whether the retailers can make any money. And the little secret about e-commerce is that retailers still haven't figured out how to make any money on it. Okay? And there's a lot of reasons for that, most notably the very high costs associated with shipping, customer acquisition, and returns. And I can get into those a little more in a minute. But because of those costs, a lot of the so-called digitally native retailers have started opening stores, right? Just go down to Armitage and Lincoln Park, you'll see a whole lot of them. Retailers that swore they would never open physical stores that have since started to do so. And you know who's also in that group? Amazon, right? Amazon 10 years ago started opening different sorts of stores, haven't all been successful. But the point is that the only way the numbers pencil for online retailing is if those retailers also have a strong and extensive brick and mortar network. That's the only way you can bring those costs down, okay?
So this is one of several sort of, I think, notions that we feel or believe to be true about the way that the retail universe works, that the data doesn't necessarily support in such black and white terms. There's also some local narratives that I think the data doesn't necessarily support. There's a sense that there's a huge amount or an insurmountable amount of vacancy, and particularly in downtown Evanston. Now, we're not standing here today saying that there isn't vacancy, there is. But putting some numbers to it, you'll see here, based on CoStar data, which does need to be ground truth, there's some caveats there with that data set, but citywide retail properties vacancy rate is somewhere around 5%. And downtown retail properties vacancy rate is somewhere around 10 to 12%. And neither one of these percentages is
This is retail, not office space.
retail space, exactly. This is
So-
the vacancy rate within retail
If it was
properties.
office space, there'd be a question of, are there actually people in it?
Yes, of course.
We don't have that question here.
Right. If it's vacant, there
there's
is
no
not
business. If
Yes.
it's occupied, there is a business.
Yes, yes. And those two vacancy rates, the 5% citywide and the maybe 10 to 12% in the downtown area, is not out of step with what a lot of places are seeing. And you don't want the vacancy rate to be much below 5 or 4, because you want space for businesses to be able to find something new, move up, move out, change locations as necessary. So you do want there to be some availability. Michael, do you want
Sarah?
to add anything there?
Can I interject with a question here?
course.
How would you compare those vacancy rates downtown to other Chicago suburban locations and submarkets, Naperville, some of the downtowns on the North Shore? Like, how do we compare to other markets here in Chicago? Because my sense is, walking around and being in other areas, that we are at a higher rate. And so I'm curious from your perspective if, how that compares to the data.
I don't have those numbers at the ready. Michael, do you have any color you can add there?
Yeah, I mean, I wish I did have those numbers. I mean, the obvious contrast, and it's not the question you asked, but I'll make it anyway. Mag Mile, the Loop, obviously in Chicago proper, but those are well into double digits. I believe Mag Mile's in the 20s. And generally speaking in retail, and again, this is a broad brush, a healthy retail, the threshold for a healthy retail district is vacancy of 10% or less. Ideally, you probably want more, something like 5. You probably don't want 1 or 2 for some of the reasons Sarah mentioned. So citywide, we're in reasonably good shape. Downtown could be better, right? But certainly not apocalyptic. There's, and indeed, Evanston is certainly not alone in this, with this problem of downtown retail recovery post-COVID.
My other question is what the story would tell if you're just looking at ground floor retail versus second floor retail locations, because if you have vacant ground floor spaces, that certainly feels different from a pedestrian experience than if you're including in those numbers, second floor retail, which feels different from a pedestrian experience.
Absolutely. Yes, and one of the next steps of our analysis is to ground truth these numbers as well as add that detail. So looking at the ground floors in downtown, seeing what's active, inactive, and somewhere in between from the urban space and urban design perspective. Okay, so talking about ground truthing, sort of things that we believe to be true. I think we need to talk about sales tax. So the graph that you see in front of you is sales tax performance. So we've indexed to 100 just to be able to actually compare Evanston, Skokie, and Wilmette. In aggregate, compared together, meaning all of the different retail categories collapsed together, Evanston sales tax has actually performed relatively well compared to Skokie and Wilmette, for instance. In recent years, it's felt rough on retail, and we know that. But there is some positivity here, and we want to share that. We want to reinforce that. Performance has been better than some neighbors, and Evanston has seen steady growth year over year. There is this perception, we know and we've heard, that Wilmette is on this meteoric rise, and they're literally and figuratively eating Evanston's lunch. And based on sales tax performance, that is not entirely true. We wanted to offer that here today. Now, there's an interesting layer here when you start breaking this out by category.
Does that, I'm just wondering if that sales tax number, I mean, the size of Evanston's footprint and the number of retail locations as compared to Wilmette, I assume is much greater.
Much greater, exactly why we indexed
So the
it.
perception of Wilmette doing better may be true at the same time that the sales tax number is greater in Evanston may also be true.
Yes, but if you're looking at the trajectory, Evanston has performed better over the last few years since 2011. Consistent improvement.
Can you explain that number? That's not per capita.
No, it is not. Michael, I'll have you jump in here.
Yeah, so this chart you see here, it's actually indexed to 100. So basically, what's the first year? I don't see the whole slide. 2011. It starts in 2011, and 100 for each of these districts is what they were generating in sales tax revenue in 2011. So what you see here, 2021, is what they are generating sales tax revenue indexed to that 2011 level, if that makes sense.
It does. Thank you.
So,
yeah, go ahead.
no, go ahead and jump in, Michael.
Oh, is this my, Is this my slide? Okay. Yeah, so here's some more shading on this by category. Comparing Evanston, Skokie, and Wilmette. I think there's a few points worth mentioning here. One, that if you look at drinking and eating places, again, Evanston still well exceeds Wilmette. Now, of course, Evanston is a larger population than Wilmette. So the difference shown there is not as great as it might seem. But still, even on a per capita basis, not an order of magnitude difference. And the other point that I wanted to mention, and we'll get into this a little more later, is you see when you look at apparel, for instance, how much more Skokie has. And yes, that's partly because of Old Orchard, but it's actually a larger concept that I'll get into in a minute. So I just wanted to flag that for when I go back to it in a little bit of time. You want to go to the next slide?
Sure. I think we should go ahead and address the apparel category nuance here.
Okay, in terms of like the critical mass point?
Yeah, I mean, so one of the ways that we use this data, I think the point that I'd like to make, one of the ways that we use this data is we don't think that growth in every single one of these categories is really what we're going to, propose here for Evanston. We want to be a little bit more nuanced about it. We want to think, what are the categories where Evanston could really excel? And where are there ways for recommendations coming out of the retail action plan to also align with Evanston's values as a community? So for example, obviously lagging behind in apparel, but fast fashion is, largely known to be one of the worst categories in terms of climate impact. So is that really a category that we want to double down and try to grow, knowing that there's so much competition locally and knowing that there are some real drawbacks to that particular sector in the industry? So just for example, when we think critically about this data when we think critically about these issues in a data-driven way, we can also make decisions that align with our core values as a community.
May I ask whether you have any breakdown on how we compare from like an independent retail store versus nationals, Evanston compared to some of our neighboring communities?
In terms of performance, we don't have that today.
Or even just the total number?
The number of independent businesses compared in your areas?
Or like percentage.
Or comparing independent businesses versus the national retail stores. So we understand sort of the overall mix of retail here in Evanston versus some of the other areas. Is that, to me, that would be of interest. Is that not part of the analysis or of interest to you guys?
Yes. I don't have a slide on that prepared today. We're just still digging through the data. But yes, we have a data set that represents all of the business licenses for the city of Evanston and restaurant establishment licenses. And we'll be able to categorize them and reflect back what that mix is for Evanston.
Thank you. That's awesome.
The next point here is that this is the monthly sales tax revenue over time. This is up here just to make the point that many cities with large universities see a really notable dip in the summer. And that's because the students leave and they have a huge economic power in those communities. This trend is true for Evanston, but it's not overwhelming. There are some communities, we were discussing, for example, earlier, Urbana-Champaign, where the dip in the summertime revenue would be much, much more dramatic. So we wanted to share that as well. So moving right along, why does retail end up where it does?
Yes, and so this will require some amount of a mind shift because we're used to thinking of these things in terms of what consumers want and how consumers decide where they're going to spend their money. But there's a second piece of that, which gets far less coverage, but is equally impactful. That is retailers or tenants, how they decide where they are going to open. And while the factors that they consider are certainly related to that first component of what consumers want, they're not exactly the same. And retailers will put emphasis on other variables that are actually kind of alien to the consumer. And I want to get into some of those because they can help to explain why retailers land where they do and why they don't open in other sorts of locations. The first point I want to make about this, though, is that in the end, whether it's a small business, whether it's a large brand, the people who make these decisions at the end of the day, they're humans. And while, as I'll get into, chains might make more use of hard numbers and metrics than small businesses, ultimately, they're humans too, right? And the reason I say that is they are just as susceptible to the psychological aspects of these decisions. And they are just as susceptible to prevailing perceptions. And that will also go into their decision making, if even on a subconscious level. Next slide.
So at a high level and a very simplified way to think about it, from a concept to business plan, there are kind of four things to think about in how and what might influence the location or viability of a retail business. You've got customer profile, so the socio-demographics of a place, how much that place is going to change, how dramatically that place is likely to change. Qualities of the place, accessibility, foot traffic, kind of the physical aspects, how accessible is it? Physical space availability, is there a space that's the size that I need? Does it have the equipment that I need? Is it a friendly management? And then rules and regulations, and that's very much about local policy, tax structure, zoning. Am I actually allowed to function the way that I need to function as a business in this place? I want to talk briefly about some of the demographic information because I think it can be helpful, but just remember this is one of many, many layers. When we think about like a customer profile, the customer profile category, the things a retailer might consider are, do the people in a place fit the ideal or typical customer to my business? So looking at Evanston's population broken into generational cohort, you see that there is a large cohort of baby boomer generation and Gen Z generation. So Gen Z, what's interesting here is that both of these can sort of be attributed to the university. So obviously Gen Z is a lot of students, so that's why you would see that bump. But it's actually pretty common, or maybe not uncommon, for a desirable university town to have a large cohort of baby boomers. And that's things like cultural offerings that are available in those places. So this chart also shows that Evanston is under-indexing for families and family builders, so the Gen X and the millennial generations. So we wanted to unfold that a little bit further. Looking at age breakdown by cohort over time, you do see that over 60 group growing from 2000 to today on the right-hand side of the left-hand chart. But on the right-hand side, we also see a trend that family households with children under the age of 18, there are fewer, the percent change is declining for family households with children under the age of 18. So Evanston's population is growing in the cohort that's over 60, and there are fewer families with young children, young families in Evanston.
Hold on, let me digest that. The blue, dark blue on the left chart, the dark blue is 2021.
Right.
The light blue is 2015, and what's the yellow? Is that 2000?
Yellow is 2000, right? So where you see the red arrows, that's where I'm just noting a more dramatic shift between in that period of time. So the right side, you're going to read that chart from left to right. And over time, from 2000, the far left, to 2021, there's been a pretty dramatic drop in families with children under 18. So again, we're not talking about a causal relationship. We're really just talking about how we understand trends that are happening and what's going on in the population. And so one of the things that's most important to the retail district action plan and the retail analysis is really
MSA, the green line on the right?
the MSA is the Chicago, Naperville, Elgin MSA. Metropolitan it's one of the census categories. So metropolitan statistical area. So that's yeah, the region. So bigger than the county and more urban focused. So what we care about is looking at trends, but I think what we really want to learn more about, and what's most relevant to the Retail Action Plan, is how likely are those trends to change on their own? And if those trends are going to continue, how likely might it be to change course if that doesn't represent the base that's going to draw the type of retailers that we want in Evanston? And thinking about the layering of information, things like the fact that Evanston's household income is tending to, earnings are getting higher. So the higher end of the income spectrum is growing most. Evanston's detached home sale price is relatively high. And what we know from postal code data, change of address, is that there is some churn, but not a huge amount of churn. Nothing terribly notable. So people are moving in and moving out, but not at a very high rate. So all of these things would suggest that this trend that Evanston is losing young families or isn't gaining them quickly, or that trend is going to continue to decline unless other factors change, is going to be influenced by some of these other things. It's going to make it more difficult to move the needle. So jumping back to the idea of what a retailer is thinking about, critical mass and co-tenancy play a huge role here.
Yes, and before I get into that, I did do a little bit of digging while Sarah was talking and found that as of 2022, the suburban Chicago retail vacancy rate stands at 10.6%. That's for everything in the suburbs. So that also includes strip centers, for instance. I have yet to uncover a number for downtowns or, in particular. I'll keep digging for that. But we'll certainly be making those comparisons as we move forward. So 10.6 versus the citywide level of about 5%. Evanston's actually not doing half bad compared to suburban Chicago as a whole.
Bob, are you getting this?
Sorry?
I just wanted to make sure the local press was catching this point here.
But I would push you to dig a little deeper, because I'm less interested in how we're doing it compared to the suburbs as a whole and all the strip centers and all that includes, and compare it to what have been successful retail submarkets, which I would point to Naperville as an example.
Yeah, and that's what I was looking for. I was looking for a downtown Naperville retail vacancy rate. In those 2 minutes, I wasn't able to find one, but I certainly will going forward.
I think that'll be interesting. Yeah. I have thought in the past when I've walked through there, I thought I'd love for the Economic Development Committee to do a field trip and go walk through Naperville, because I think it would be very informative to consider it from a physical planning, sense of place, types of retail stores. I think it would be very interesting.
Yeah. No, definitely a comparable that we'll be looking closely at. But getting back to the flow of what we were saying. So yes, Sarah gave you some examples of how retailers, what they're looking for in terms of the customer profile when they're deciding where to locate. This next concept is a little less intuitive. But it is critical to understand, no pun intended, in retail, the notion of critical mass. And retailers and brokers will throw this term around a lot. And sometimes if you push them for a definition, they'll say, well, I can't really define it, but I certainly know when I see it, right? And it's basically the point at which, a district or center gets large enough, right, that it becomes a destination and draws volumes of customers in an exponentially increasing way, right? When a district reaches a critical mass, is really another way of saying, there's lots of stores here, right? And so people are coming not just for one particular store, but because it's the place to go to shop, period, right? And there's a number of reasons why retailers gravitate to these sorts of districts and centers. One is that they know that you, the consumer, when you're looking for selection, that's where you're going to go, right? But it's not just that. It's also that a retailer, and this is putting it putting it rather simplistically, but a retailer figures that even if they turn out not to be very good at generating traffic on their own, they can at least rely on the traffic generated by their neighbors, right? And so there's a certain safety in numbers mentality. In fact, the old proverb is that retailers are like lemmings. They will follow each other off a cliff. They're pack animals, right? And so they are drawn to these districts and centers that have what's known as lots of co-tenancy, other retailers just like them. And these are the districts and centers that have this vaunted critical mass. You know, to be really basic about it, I'm often asked, why do we have intersections with 4 gas stations, right? Or why do all the fast food restaurants cluster in the same place, right? Or why do we have concentrations of bars or antique rows or design districts full of furniture stores or malls with lots of apparel retailers, right? It's for this reason, right? It's because they're all gravitating to that critical mass where there's lots of co-tenancy, right? Now, the most important co-tenants are obviously the anchors. These are the large stores that are primarily responsible for generating foot traffic, right? And they're often what other retailers look to when deciding whether or not to locate in a certain district or center. And historically, we were able to rely on department stores for this purpose, right? Whether it was downtown districts or later regional malls. Obviously, department stores aren't what they once were. And so the whole concept of anchoring has kind of evolved over the years in the last 2 decades, right? Now you'll see grocery stores, especially these grocery stores that have a specialty positioning like Whole Foods, able to serve as major anchors, right? And you're even seeing non-retail uses playing this role of anchors. Northwestern's a perfect example of this. Northwestern in certain ways is the ultimate anchor because as a retailer considering whether to locate in Evanston, they know Northwestern ain't going anywhere, right? They're not going to up and leave, like, say, a major employer, major private employer, right? They are here for the duration, and there's a lot of stability in that, right? But not just Northwestern, public spaces can also serve as anchors, great public spaces, for instance, right? The real nuance to this, though, is that are these anchors bringing people who want to shop, right? What are they bringing people for? If you think of a movie theater as an anchor, when's the last time you shopped for clothing before you went to a movie? Not often. So yeah, it will anchor for restaurants and bars, maybe not so much for shopping. Public space. Well, you know, these people aren't coming with the notion of shopping at all necessarily. That's what was so great about department stores. We knew why they were coming. So with these non-retail anchors, we have to be, a little bit more cautious in estimating just how much of an anchoring role they can play.
And
Next
so
slide.
one of the next steps of the project is going to be where we're looking at each of the districts, including downtown, identifying what are the anchors, either there today or things that are in the planning process, about to unfold, about to unveil, and think about what is the real value of that as an anchor, as a draw, as it pertains to the retail environment. So talking about those major employers, talking about things like a movie theater, what does that actually mean for the brick and mortar retailers that would be close by or associated with a trip to the movies?
And why would you do that? I mean, I understand the value of those anchors, those particular anchors, but what's your goal in identifying those and why they're valuable? I mean,
well, I think some of these anchors really tell the story of a place. Some of them are drivers of activity. Some of them, in some cases, like in the case of downtown, it's going to be a real uphill battle to lift every block of downtown at the same time. But if we can find those anchors, if we can find the co-tenancies, the things that would lure in retailers more willingly or sooner, you can start to make those changes as dominoes falling, and it'll feel like the momentum that downtown needs.
you'll be identifying the anchors. Not right. So I'm not. I guess I'm not quite clear. I understand the value of anchors. I'm just not understanding how being able to accurately identify their value where you take it from there in terms of.
Sure. It goes back to Michael's point, which is that not all anchors draw in the same way. So if you are going to, let's use the department store example. If you're coming to a large department store anchor, you're coming as a shopper. You're readily coming with your wallet out saying, I'm probably going to buy something today. And so the way that you interact with your environment, the reason, the purpose for the trip is different. Like Michael said, it's not so often maybe in recent memory that you can think, I was really intending on going somewhere to go to the movies, and I stopped in to buy a pair of jeans beforehand. It's just not really the way that we think about our trips. So when we think about trying to make sure that those anchors can do well, and how can we tee up the areas near them to benefit most from that anchor, we have to think about what is the real value of the anchor that's coming.
So
or that
I
is
wonder-
there.
Could I offer, as an example for discussion, Northlight Theater,
Sure.
which is coming back in a few years, be a great anchor for that portion of downtown. But in contemplating what that might mean for retail in that neighborhood, we're probably not looking for toy stores. You're probably looking at bars and restaurants. Is that the point you're driving at?
But yes.
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
also wonder, to Alderman Kelly's point, I mean, when you're looking at anchors, you're looking at nodes of activity, right? And so if you're determining where you're going to build out from, you're going to build out from where the natural nodes are now. So you wouldn't start where there's no anchors, there's no nodes, but you're going to build a strategy around those nodes. Does that make sense?
Yep.
And you
Yep.
build a strategy
Exactly.
that matches what the anchor is.
Exactly.
Right, so if it's a theater that's drawing mostly nighttime crowds, it's bars and restaurants rather than a grocery store being an anchor in and of itself.
And this also
Right.
comes around again when we start thinking about place branding and celebrating identity and thinking about how people use a downtown area, since that's what we're talking about. If we're thinking about the communication of what's available to you, if you're making the trip to the movie theater, the type of information that you want to build around that trip, it's a date night, it's a, whatever it may be, or programming associated with that movie theater, a particular type of movie that's being shown that's tailored to kids. That has implications for a lot of the different areas that we're touching with this project.
But the shoe store probably wants to move closer to the grocery store. And
Right.
somebody who wants to open a bar or restaurant is going to be thinking about one of the theaters.
Exactly.
Right.
Chair, I have a comment, if I could be recognized.
Yes, Councilmember
All right,
Burns.
go ahead, Councilmember Burns.
And you may have gotten into this already, so excuse me, but how much of this is on our end as a city to proactively identify businesses that we want to introduce to these different areas in Evanston? And I'll leave it there.
Sure. What you're talking about is having some additional guidance, clarity on what are really meaningful recruitment efforts that would then be associated to something like really understanding what the anchors draw to a place. And that we'll be getting into that with this project.
And I guess just so I know from the start, but you see value in a city recruiting businesses and not simply sitting back waiting, creating the environment and then waiting for businesses to be interested, to show an interest, but to be actively identifying businesses that we think work in certain, pockets, retail corridors in Evanston.
I think that's true. I think that what we're seeing in the data, and I think what you're feeling in downtown, is that there's a posture that's changing. That Evanston had a real momentum and feeling of growth. And so the city as a partner was regulating, was stewarding, making sure that things were going to a common goal and moving along appropriately. And in the world the way it is today, and in sort of a recovery posture, we have to think a little bit more about how we get ahead of it. How do we work towards recruitment? How are we building as an active partner in growing these retail districts?
And
Thank you.
one thing I'll add to that, Alderman Burns, I think there was a time when a more passive kind of approach would have been sufficient. But I think, in this day and age, I'm relatively bullish on brick and mortar retail, but that's not to deny that there's a smaller pool of potential tenants than there once was. right? And in order to be the communities that get those tenants, right, you have to be more proactive than in the past. You know, and that can involve a lot of different programs and initiatives, including recruitment. What we also want to do here is to give you the guidance on what that means in terms of the kinds of retail that would be most realistic and the locations where they're most likely to be successful. And so that's part of what we'll be getting into in the months ahead.
And hopefully there'll be recommendations on, and you know, sometimes this means additional staff, sometimes it means kind of reorganizing things, but it would be great to have some recommendations on how we can better, if that is the case, how we can better support and equip our economic development team to make that shift to being, you know, more recruitment oriented as opposed to passive, but making sure they have the tools they need to be effective.
Yep.
Absolutely.
Definitely.
Thank you.
So should I take it from here, Sarah?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so we did want to say a few things about chains versus independence. I know that is an important value in Evanston, as it is in many communities. You know, I think that we want to provide a little more nuance to that as well. I've never believed that it's a binary chains versus mom and pops, but more along the lines of a continuum. Large national brands on one end and unique local independent on the other. And there's a lot in between there. For one thing, franchises are not the same as chains. Franchises pay to use a proven operating model, but they are almost always smaller independent entrepreneurs who are putting their capital on the line. So there's a little bit of a difference there. There's also a lot of what I call chainlets, whether on a local, regional, even national basis. Maybe they have 2 to 9 locations. And then there's mom and pops who they're not exactly your grandmother's mom and pop. They can be very well capitalized. They can be the tech entrepreneur who sold his business to Google and now wants to open a clothing store and is a mom and pop, but a very deep pocketed one who can afford a very high rent. So there's a lot of nuance to it that we'll get into. Next slide. And obviously, and you know, one point I want to also make about it is that along this continuum, all these different sorts of retailers make decisions a little bit differently, right? As I said earlier, your largest national brands will rely a little more on hard numbers, on metrics and thresholds that you must meet, or else they're just not going to even consider the possibility. They're going to probably prioritize co-tenancy more. Whereas your small business might be willing to take more chances based on local knowledge, perhaps even sentiment. And so, you know, there will be different ways in which these retailers make decisions and different appeals we'd need to make if we want to attract them. The final point I want to make about this is that the kinds of retailers that we can get in one district or another might vary quite a bit. You know, next slide. If you look, for instance, in downtown, there are some space and financial realities that do constrain what kinds of businesses would be possible there. This is an early 20th century downtown with oftentimes larger, deeper storefronts than many small businesses need or can afford. And also there's the question of rents, and we got into this a little bit before, but I want to get into a little more detail into it now, because there is kind of the notion that somehow landlords just pick rents out of thin air. Any landlord that actually has some savvy and understanding knows they can't just do that. Rents have to have a relationship, have to maintain a relationship to the projected gross sales of the retailers they're trying to attract. Because in retail, there's a general rule of thumb that you're generally not supposed to spend more than 10% of your projected gross sales on rent. And if you do, then you're not so likely to survive. So if a landlord decides to charge rents, which will require retailers to spend 20% of their gross sales on rent, that retailer will probably not survive. That space will go vacant. Maybe you'll get another tenant stupid enough to take that deal, but the space will go vacant again. There'll be constant turnover. So the landlord can't just call all the shots here. They have to price their space according to what retailers are capable of grossing in a given district. So just to give you some numbers as an example of this, right? If a retailer is going to be paying $26. So we ran some numbers, and right now, the median retail rent in downtown is $26.40 per square foot per year. When you add in the various expenses that are passed through to the tenant, right, it goes up to about $38 per square foot. So for a 2,000 square foot space, that's $77,000 a year that the tenant has to pay. If it's going to keep to that 10% rule, then a shop would need to gross about $770,000 a year, right? Restaurants, it's less than 10%. It's usually 5 to 7%. A restaurant would have to do about $1.54 million a year, okay? So all of this is a way of saying there are relationships here that dictate what prevailing rents can be. And landlords can't just, on a whim decide what they are. They can, but they probably won't be able to maintain the space as occupied for all that long, right? So that's kind of an important nuance to keep in mind. Next slide.
So bringing it home, I think all of these ideas, understanding the market, how the retailers would look at it, some of the constraints that might be put on building owners or managers when they set leasing rates, comes back to here, why we're in the room today, which is we're putting together a retail action plan that's organized by the city and partners. So we really need to play in our lane. We need to talk specifically and intentionally about how we can make improvements that are within our control as the city, as this entity. And those are very much on the left-hand side of this. So the city has control over public realm, policy, and regulations. The city has influence over visibility and marketing. But when it comes to once you walk through the door, the city has no control over what merchandise is actually on the shelves or power over actually turning a customer into a buyer, actually turning an individual who's visiting a store into someone who's going to the register and paying for something. So when we think about the things that the city can control, a lot of it falls in the category of rules and regulations, and then also the quality of space that can be created between the buildings, between the merchants and the feel. So what we really want to focus on in this plan is how a space is designed to draw people, to make a nice place to inhabit, to go as a destination. Looking at things like protocols, rules, and regulations around parking and incentives that might be possible. In particular, we've heard a lot of demand for events and programming. A call for Evanston to be more experimental and have more fun. You know, we need to take a good hard look at the way that city can be a partner and can facilitate the types of things that people want to do outside of the stores that are also a reason to come out in the first place.
Sarah, may I interject? Sure. I'd like to make a connection between this slide and something else that's on the agenda later, which is the outdoor dining permits. And one, the cost of, so if we're looking at the public realm policy and regulations, so those things that are in our control, the cost of permits certainly is within the realm of the city's control, and how that outdoor dining experience feels and looks is within the city's control. And while I don't understand from a public service, like public works viewpoint, our outdoor dining looks and feels very different from other successful outdoor dining experiences, because we have these huge concrete barriers, which I understand the safety concern, but others, other municipalities don't treat their outdoor dining experience that way. And so I'd love your viewpoint when you guys are looking at this as to how the city, from this public realm policy and regulations, can positively impact, sort of the types of outdoor dining experiences that we're able to see.
I think you're absolutely right. And just from our business owner task force, we've heard this. We've heard, you take a look, see how Evanston stacks up in terms of protocols for, noise nuisance, or how late bars or restaurants could play music out loud. That's something that there's a real interest in comparing how Evanston controls and limits versus somewhere else. Similarly with large events, the process to realize a large event or something that shuts down a street, it might feel like it's an arduous process in Evanston, whereas some near communities, and this is, I'm sharing this as ideas that have been brought up in these conversations, but that it feels different than some of the surrounding areas. They might feel a little more welcome to something different.
And I was going to ask about that. It's not just necessarily the cost of the permit,
Sure.
but the arduousness of the process, even if the permit is reasonable.
Yeah.
So I'd appreciate some feedback on that and how Evanston compares to other communities.
Yeah, and I can say we've looked at food trucks in the same way, and we're in the process of kind of packaging all of those ideas. But permit dollar for dollar, not wildly out of whack. It's really navigating maybe process and procedure, and then what you can do once you get it. How is it flexible? What is the term that you're allowed to exercise this thing that you just worked to get access to?
Right.
So it's all of that.
And then on a separate note, you mentioned parking. I noticed that parking, I don't see appearing on the list, but you see.
Parking management.
There we go. I didn't get down to the bottom yet. It is there. So you want to make sure you're aware that we just completed a parking study.
Yes.
And to the extent that that information can feed into your process, want to make sure you're aware of that and can
Absolutely.
take that into account.
Yes, I mean, all of the plans are being taken into account, the past downtown plan, climate action, all of these. It's a lot to read, but we're up for it.
Yeah, thanks.
So we talked a lot. Any other questions?
Thank you very much.
Sure.
So, you talked a little bit about the kind of retail that we can get versus, well, you didn't talk about the kind we want. And, that's what I want to hear more about. And I think a lot of us have ideas, and we've seen how certain blocks of sort of human-scale buildings like Central Street and Dempster or Main, we have more of a thriving situation where people gravitate to some of these areas. I'd like to hear a little bit more about, and I don't know if the survey's in, but, what people want or your sense. And I have a feeling it's not going to change drastically from city to city, but, I mean, given our location that we are relatively, a city that values culture, and with the university, I think there are some desires for a type of retail that we want. And I think we should also, I think what we'd like from you is some explicit, not just like what we can get. Because we could turn the whole town into like formula stores. If we wanted to, right? Because if we just did that, if we just took what we can get, because okay, we have this, this anchor store here, so therefore we have to get this. I think we have to be careful to really examine what we want as a city to really make this place the quality of living. I want to hear more about quality of living, and I've seen many cities across the nation take measures. For example, to draw in retail, sometimes they're punitive, where they have fines for leaving store spaces empty, because there is a trend nationwide to jack up rents right now. I mean, this is a thing that, in getting tax breaks if you're for vacancy. So I think I'd like to hear measures that cities are taking to really bring in more local businesses and help the identity and the quality of living, actual measures. And go ahead and do tell us, I think your point is well taken. About our outdoor dining. I think we can do better. I know we worked very hard, with Farmhouse, to create more of a European sort of setting an arrangement, and I think we do need to change some of our policies, and I think it'd be really great for, to hear that straight from you all. Some of these things that we can do, measures that we really can take to improve the quality of living based on what we want, not just on what we can get.
I think that well put, and the way that I don't have, we don't have recommendations ready yet, but I know that we see a real latent potential in Evanston, not just the university, not just the fact that you have an urban fabric, not just the fact that you've got a larger population than the near areas, not just the fact that you do have some strong anchors in downtown like the Whole Foods and some coming like Northlight. But Evanston really should stand out among the communities of the North Shore. And so we really needed to start this question, or we needed to start this effort by asking why. Why isn't Evanston standing out? What are the things that really need to change? What are the ways that we could change those things and change the trajectory? But celebrating the things that are already here that do set Evanston apart and telling that story more loudly and celebrating Evanston, what makes Evanston unique on the North Shore, not just size, but all of these other factors, is where we're going.
And Sarah, if I could add just a couple of things from the disembodied voice. This is Mike. Sorry for how creepy this is. I'm really not that creepy in real life. Yeah, I think this starts certainly from what people want and what they value. I think what will be our jobs and what will, and what will be not always easy to untangle is that, and this we see repeatedly, what people say they want and what they are willing to support aren't always the same thing. I mean, so we have to kind of tease it out. That you saw that New Yorker cartoon on one of the slides of the person who lives above the independent bookshop and waves hello to the proprietor in the morning, all while accepting her Amazon delivery. That is a real thing. So I think that's something that we'll always try to be attentive to. And the other part is that, yes, there are a lot of proactive steps that communities are trying to take, whether it's legacy business ordinances, and obviously Evanston's now one of them, and commercial vacancy taxes. And a lot of these are intriguing. I think what our job will also be is how to tease out what could be the unintended consequences of any of those. A commercial vacancy tax, for instance, you worry that, okay, if you're going to penalize someone for keeping a space vacant, will that depress interest in actually even investing in more risky locations in the first place? Making sure that if there is something that's intriguing like that we make sure we understand all the potential trade-offs. So that's going to be the work that we'll be doing in the months ahead. But I'm glad that you pointed it out.
I also want to point out that I'm not presenting survey findings tonight because the survey is still open. We're also about to release a Spanish version, so it'll remain open a little bit longer to make sure that we can promote that appropriately. But we right now today have over 1,500 responses. And those are all with short answer responses because we didn't make it an easy survey. So we have some really, really wonderful data to sift through reflecting community ideas.
One additional question, and I don't know if this is in your scope, but are you guys looking at sort of, one of the points that the municipality can impact is sort of the sense of place, right? That public realm. And so are you guys looking at placemaking opportunities and how that intersects with the retail environment?
Yes, absolutely. And we also have a great partner in this work, Altogether Studio, who are Evanston-based, know the ins and outs of Evanston very, very well. And their, particular focus is in placemaking, place branding, and marketing.
One of, this is just my perception, I've always heard, clean it up, green it up, right, is the first thing out the gate before you're able to attract retailers. Our downtown feels dirty. I get off the train and it smells like urine. Like these are, I think, very real issues that we need to address to attract retailers and retain retailers. And so I'm just, that clean it up, green it up, that placemaking, those kind of things, I think I need to be addressed here.
Fortunately, we have already taken steps to address specifically those concerns with the Clean Team Street Plus Ambassador program, which is going to be rolling out in mid-November specifically to do that. But that gets into something I wanted to ask about, which is one of the slides said psychology and perception. And the point there was that it was psychology and perception of the retailers, right?
Yes.
Not the customers. And those
Right.
are related, but so I would be interested in some feedback from the retailers about their perceptions on exactly what Lisa was talking about. How does it feel to them based on the perception of cleanliness, the perception of safety? There's panhandlers in Evanston. There's also panhandlers in other places too. So if they're comparing potential locations for their businesses, what does that really mean for us? Or what do they perceive? And, I hesitate to say it, but their perception is kind of their reality.
Right.
Right?
Yep.
Yeah, exactly.
Yep.
Exactly. And we've had one task force meeting of business owners and other stakeholders in the business community. We got some really great feedback. I think one thing that comes to mind that's directly related to what you're asking is the, real and perceived safety challenges that downtown is experiencing right now. Amongst the business owners, there is a palpable desire for the sense of a plan, the sense of a really coordinated strategy to improve the circumstances that the business owners are experiencing. Now, this is me sharing what we heard directly from the business owners, but I think what I heard pretty clearly was there's just a desire to feel that we're all rowing in the same direction.
Yeah, and what I would add to that, Sarah, is, part of this process is not just talking with the business owners that are here already, but to understand how the tenant and the broker is viewing Evanston, the ones who aren't here yet, or who don't want to come, or are hesitant to do so. And I think there'll be a lot of that in our process as well. Again, to understand just what you're saying, how is Evanston viewed across the region as a retail location? And yeah, in many cases, it's very different from how Evanston itself views itself as a retail location. Precisely for some of the factors I mentioned, they're looking at different attributes, whether it's co-tenancy or what have you.
And so where are we at with this process? We have some work to do. This is kind of a status report. How long is it going to take us to get to our destination here?
So we're still on track to have a final deliverable early next year. What you're going to see is a shift from the sort of rote data collection and processing and sort of the initial phase of the survey to just sort of collect and process. And we will start actually kind of turning it back. So we're going to start showing more ideas, urban design and public space opportunities, really highlighting some more concrete ideas to move forward, and then outlining what are kind of preliminary recommendations, and looking at them with these different groups of stakeholders, yourselves included, to say, is this realistic? How could we move this forward? And actually put some bounds around this project. So from here, it will feel a bit like a shift. We're going to shift to thinking about what we do with the information rather than just how do we get the information that we need.
And I don't know if you had a chance to look at our 2009 downtown plan? You did, okay.
Is it
And how-
2007?
is it-
2009?
I think, I'm looking at the 2009.
Oh, I'm sorry. I had
adopted.
2007 in my head.
Yeah, and how that, I don't know if that was helped to inform any, there's a part on retail and
Yeah,
how that.
yeah. So reviewing it and folding it in, I believe, if I'm not wrong, that was a 10-year horizon on that plan, which would have been 2017. And so it's thinking about, what are the things that we can carry forward in today's world and circumstances as they are. And also, is that really still on track with what we're
Right,
what
no,
we're
that's what
hearing
I'm
from the
wondering,
public?
if you looked at that, what parts you feel are still relevant. I also wondered, I know you can't quite do exit interviews, but it would take some degree of outreach to find out why retail is leaving. I think that's really important to
definitely doing
survey.
that.
Yeah, because I know,
Definitely.
high rent is part of it, and I also know sometimes it's just having property owners that are nice to deal with, that can make a difference.
And
So-
also some of the new businesses. So we're engaging with some of the new businesses to talk specifically about how they navigated the process. Do they have experience working with any other municipalities? And was it better or worse.
Right, but it'd be great to, and I know, again, that will take some research and outreach sometimes because some have left Evanston altogether or some have moved, but it would be really great to hear some results of conversations with folks who have had to leave Evanston.
Yeah. But in terms of actionable deliverables to us, or recommendations that we could deliver on, it's not going to happen in time for our budget cycle.
We'll have, okay. Paul says no. Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you, Councilmember Nuzzo. So the deadline, or what we've discussed, is a kind of a January, February deliverable. When we discussed ARPA last, I don't know if it was last year, like the pandemics kept run together, but we said we're going to pause, not ask the committee for any more funding for any kind of like economic development, traditional business development initiative until this study was done, because this was the driver of that. Now we are at a risk, frankly, of, I didn't think we'd say this, but running out of ARPA. I mean, we saw recently that we're down on the negative economic impact section, somewhere in the range of 5 million. We don't know what the findings are going to be. We don't know what the recommendations are going to be. Is that going to be enough seed to, along with other capital improvement, other federal requests, state funding for infrastructure? Maybe it is. I don't know. I'm just planting that seed that we might want to just pause a little bit on just for a few more months on that remaining balance of that negative impact. But for the November budget season, we don't have any recommendations yet.
Right, nothing concrete enough. So the recommendation is just to make sure, hopefully, we have some money in reserve or unallocated to act on recommendations when they come in February.
Right, because I don't think Interface is ready to say, hey, we need to make the streets two ways. Like that's what I want to recommend to you right now. Let's go do that. I'm not sure that there's a need for that. I think there might be. We're not ready yet. We're not ready to, we really don't have a complete, I don't want to say comprehensive plan because that's a different process. We want to have a complete downtown plan wrapped up end of January before we make any recommendations.
And I don't think it'll all be necessarily ARPA, right? Some of this will be
Right.
regular line items that would be recurring
CIP,
expenditures,
there's
like
TIF
for
from
legacy
different-
businesses.
Legacy
Yeah.
business, infrastructure, TIF. Well, TIF in the downtown, no, but TIF in the other districts, yes.
Yeah.
Correct.
Paul, was there not a line item under ARPA reserved for economic development? Like I stepped away, and so I recall a number 8 to 10 million.
Yes.
And
So-
so is that still held somewhere so that when this comes out, is that your point that
was my
number is
point.
dwindling?
That is my point, because we categorized it kind of right when you were departing, and we are allocating for economic development committee purposes in the work we do. There was somewhere in the range of 10 million under negative economic impacts. That was a category. That number is dwindling because there's other other things we need to address. And since we're not front and center with this project with recommendations yet, the money's fading away. I don't want to ring alarm bells. There's 5 million left in it right now out of that 10 or 12. I'm going to send you an updated version of the presentation that Sarah Flax provided at City Council, just so you can see.
It's not the case where our committee was assigned a budget and it's up
Correct.
to us to spend that money.
Right. And
Yeah, there's
we-
a lot of competing interests.
We tried to do that, though. That was the initial process, but that did
Yeah.
not win out at the end of the day.
And do you, besides, so you'll make some recommendations, are you, as part of the service, do you assist with moving forward with any of the recommendations, or will you just say, this is what we suggest you do? Or do you roll up your sleeves and help us
Well, we
with
hope
some
it
of
feels
those?
a little better than that when we're done. So there's a couple phases, right? There's ideation, there's coming up with ideas, and that's very much a collaborative task. There's once we sort of feel like we've got some front runners, then there's a whole nother phase of talking about prioritization. What needs to happen first? Where do we need to grow organizational capacity or pull in additional partners? What is the part of the city? What is the part of other partners? And in all of that, we also talk about early actions. And so what we do, Interface Studio has been involved in sort of shaping early actions in lots of different ways. And sometimes that's coming up with a full concept for a pop-up, just to make it feel like there's momentum coming out of putting the stamp on this plan. We don't know exactly what that looks like yet, but it's every intention that we feel like you've got the tools that you need to feel like you've really got the first step lined up.
So for example, you could potentially see through a few pop-ups. You would help us? I mean, I'm just trying to understand practically, boots on the ground, besides the recommendations, just some examples of.
It could be. I don't have Marisa from Altogether on the call right now, but I do think there are things in the realm of activation and how we promote this plan and the individual districts that are included in the work that we're doing.
Great. Oh, and Lisa, I do love the idea of us taking a trip to Naperville. I think we should talk about that. I think that would be interesting to look at. So I think absolutely that's something Evanston should always do in every realm is compare and take the best from other communities. So I'd be very interested in talking more about that for our Economic Development Committee.
No, not from me. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was really, really informative. Thank you.
If I may, just for a minute, I appreciate you, council members, Ms. Deacon, whoever else is on. I don't know what other guests we have on our Zoom, but that was a lengthy presentation, but it was really meant to be educational, and I hope I felt like you were really engaged, and I really appreciate it. We don't get a chance to do this kind of thing very often, and I've said this to my colleagues. I feel like I'm putting a lot of weight behind, or a lot of energy behind, what Interface is doing for us, and to me, it's really critical for our community that this report and their findings and the recommendations are considered seriously, and we take that report at the end if we all as a community like what we're hearing and implement that. I'm a little nervous because if we don't like it, we've spent a lot of time doing it, right? And I don't know what the answer is. So I really am just really excited that you really sat and listened to a really detailed presentation tonight.
So Paul, to that point,
Yeah.
when do they come back? So is there going to be another check-in so that you're not sort of giving us the deliverable and we're like, oh, wait a minute, this isn't what we need, so that there is another opportunity for us to continue to shape it?
You want to answer that?
Yeah, so we kind of mapped out what the next few months will look like, and the next thing on the horizon is what we're calling community conversations, and it's going to be an event that draws the sort of business owner community and some of the other stakeholders that have been involved in the project to really wrestle with some ideas. And then coming out of that, we'll have what we would kind of consider the preliminary recommendations we want to start fleshing out and really moving forward with. And I think it would be appropriate to present to this group again before the end of the year. And then with that gut check, with that check-in with you all, we would move to formalizing and talking in detail about implementation.
That sounds great.
Great.
Okay, so traditionally that would be like the first Wednesday of December, because you don't have a Thanksgiving meeting and we wrap it up for the year. So that would be it. Like, yeah. So we'll figure that out, first or second. Okay, Councilmember Kelly or Chair Kelly, there were 3 communications items included in the packet. We're trying something a little different with how we didn't necessarily think we need to discuss the items. There are communication items that we think are important for the community and for the committee to be aware of. One is a grant that we partnered with the Rogers Park Business Alliance in Chicago, the only Chicago area cities that received the RISE grant, a $90,000 planning grant. We're going to coordinate with the Chicago side of Howard to come up with a plan that works on both sides of the street, like begin that coordination. Secondly, there's a communication about the Sustain Evanston incentive program that will be in the budget hearings in November. We're requesting a $250,000 addition to the Economic Development Fund to help with incentives for energy retrofits and waste management modernization. And then finally, I think somebody referenced the Sidewalk Cafe communication that's coming out of community development. We wanted to make you aware of that and determine if there were any concerns you had. Included with that is a kind of a small table comparing sidewalk cafe permits. You can see the numbers yourself and decide if it's at the very last page of the packet. That's something that you'll be taking up either in planning and development or administration and public works.
May I note on that point, I think it does get to what we just talked about in seeing how Evanston compares. And so I wonder if, before that's discussed and decided on it, whatever public body it is, it would be interesting to have them weigh in on that before those numbers are determined. Because in my view, we are out of line with some of our neighboring communities, and we're not getting in the public realm in that sense of place what other communities are getting, probably because of the rules and regs that we are creating. And so I think that needs to be unpacked a little bit before it's just voted on. And I don't want to be penny wise and pound foolish, right? So we're getting our permit fees, yay, but at the end of the day, it's not serving us in a broader, from the broader view.
I think, yeah.
Right, I think this would be like Monday evening or Tuesday when the parking study came up, there was an ask to pause until this study was done. So I'll leave that up to the wisdom of the collective city council, but that information is out there for you.
Thank you. No, I agree. I think this is something we need to pause on as well before we increase fees.
Will we get a copy of what was presented today? I don't remember seeing that. Sure. Okay.
And I believe the recording with all the audio also.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, we will post the recording once the team edits it, and we will post, if you don't mind, post the PowerPoint? Great. So yeah, we'll post the actual slide deck as well.
Okay, thank you.
Yes. That way you don't have to take notes next time. I saw you.
I wish to take notes to further
Yeah.
understand, but I just want to make sure that we're looking at the equity piece really seriously with the community. So I just want to look at
Great.
that a little more. Thank you.
Thank you. And Paul, the economic development report, is there a committee?
Yeah,
Do we need to,
again, that's a reference piece to see, latest development activity. It's probably 80% up to date. Things happen relatively quickly, and then there's also a real estate transfer tax report.
And our regular question about the movie theater.
Yes. The way I respond to that is the ownership of the building has reported that the movie theater will open at the end of October. That has not been confirmed by AMC, and each time the owner has told us that it's opening up at the end of the month, the end of that month comes, and then the answer is it's the end of the following month. So we're trying to set expectations, but I can only report what the ownership has reported to us. But it makes sense. Holiday season's coming up, and they have their permits, and they're doing work in there, so let's hope.
4th of July would have made sense. Memorial Day would have made sense.
Yeah.
Two other anchor type questions. Any updates? There was conversation about moving the farmers market. Is that still under consideration? Is one question. And are there any updates on Fountain Square and fully utilizing its full design there?
Yeah, I'll answer the first one. I'll ask the council members to give an update on Fountain Square because I don't have an update. I don't know if the farmers market was an idea pre-COVID. That's been shelved for now. I still have my own kind of professional opinion about it. I think it would be a wonderful addition to the downtown. I don't think our community is ready for that yet. I think the farmers market constituents love where it is. I'm not going to interfere in that, but and we'll also maybe ask our consultant to study that. See what other communities do, but there's no movement or no plan to make any movements. Regarding Fountain Square, I don't know if there's anything public that we can discuss. The lawsuit is ongoing.
That's public information.
Yeah.
Fountain's broken. City's gonna pay to fix it, is my understanding,
Well,
correct?
no, that's not certain yet. I mean, it will be fixed because we're currently involved in a lawsuit. So we're waiting to see what direction that's going.
Right, and frankly, there's an opportunity to maybe revisit the design. I know it's pretty new design, but maybe we've learned some things over the last 3 years or so that the Christmas tree has been replaced once a year. The whole idea was the tree was supposed to be planted forever, and it's replaced just like cutting down a tree. Why is that? Because salt gets at the roots, and the landscaping around the base of the tree is all dead, and there's just some things I think we can reevaluate. I think we're open to it.
Right, and I think we recently contracted with a construction firm that, a legal firm that specializes in construction, so I think we're feeling like we're in good hands
Good.
on that front. So I think we're waiting before we make a decision whether to go ahead and allocate funds to see when that might be coming.
It's your ward, so I'll defer to you.
And I promise I won't be so chatty in future meetings, but I've had a lot of pent-up questions. And so one final question. I think there's an opportunity at hand, which is to communicate, to find additional communication channels with the residents of Evanston. I think there's a lot of people that, you know, you put out the newsletters, I read them, but most people don't read them. I think most people want to know what's happening with the movie theater, what's happening with Fountain Square, and there's this general sense of like apathy, I think, about, you know, sort of what's happening, what is the city doing, and I think we need to think, a little bit more about how we communicate momentum so that people understand that there is stuff at work and there's real openings and there's real momentum. And I think that's an important part of what we need to be thinking about here.
Okay, I appreciate that. Yeah.
Bob also taking note, right? Yeah.
Bob, can you, if, by the way, the roundtable is doing a fantastic job covering a lot of things, but I appreciate what you're saying, Ms. Deacon. There's an opportunity for better communication.
Okay, I think that's it. So, thank you. Thank you again for the wonderful presentation, and fabulous. And we'll look forward to the next one in, what did we say? In December. Second Wednesday of December. Great, second Wednesday of December. Okay, thank you. All right, meeting adjourned.